Probably need to use the left button though.
There we go. Okay. So this is supposed to be a very practical kind of talk. As usual, I want to start out with some general observations about the situation that you confront as publishers of academic stuff. And I want the most important stuff to be at the beginning and at the end. And so I regard the problem of managing your own feelings and your own behavior as a central part of the publishing process. And I want to end by talking some about that. I want to frame the whole discussion by starting with a review of what is the context in which we're trying to publish and what do we know about it. And more specifically, I'll talk some about what various studies of reviewers and editors have shown about their characteristics. And then I'll get kind of practical in here about how do you actually do the nitty-gritties of submitting articles to journals and dealing with the responses you get. And end by talking about essentially the management of your own body. Of course, the most striking feature of the last dozen years has been this emphasis on so-called A journals. That wasn't a characteristic of the 1970s or the 1980s. It came along later, and it's almost identifiable when it happened. And the other feature is that the publishing industry is one of the most turbulent industries in the world. There's been a great deal of consolidation. There used to be maybe 20 major publishing houses. There used to be, then a few years later, there were 6 major publishing houses, and now I have a friend who negotiated for textbooks for a university in Florida, and he found that he could buy all the textbooks for almost all the undergraduate courses from 2 publishers. 2 companies owned all the rights. The background of this is for business students, but the pattern has been similar for economics, I think. It's an exponential rise in the numbers of these students. These are actually MBA counts. In 1950, there were only 3,000 MBAs graduated. Last year, or for the last few years, there have been over 100,000 a year being graduated, which has been really good for me because it means that my salary has always been rising and there have always been jobs somewhere else. It also means that business professors got paid more than economists, for example, right? Because there's this demand by the students, and so we're always looking for somebody to teach marketing or finance or whatever. Then another thing that happened was that in the late 1980s, first Business Week and then other magazines started to put out ratings of business schools. And then that was so successful, they extended this to universities more generally. They started rating undergraduate programs and graduate programs and whatever. This turned what had been a very casual competition between schools that nobody had any quantitative data about. So you would say, well, maybe Northwestern is different from Chicago, but nobody knew how they were different exactly. Into something that really had numbers. And whether the numbers meant anything, who knows? But it meant something in their consequences. It meant something. It meant that students who are trying to decide where to go to school could say, I want the one with the best numbers. It meant that people who wanted to give money for schools could say, I want to give my money to the highest ranking schools, and so on. And it suddenly became a serious competition, especially at the top of these schools. It makes millions and millions of dollars difference. And business schools, which in the 1970s used to be even undesirable at many universities because they were exploiters of the workers and well, I don't want to say rapists, but pillagers of the wealth of the society and so on, they suddenly became highly valued by the universities because they're now a source of revenue, and they can be used to subsidize history and Spanish history and whatever, right? So all the business schools I have ever known have paid large amounts of money to be in the campus where they are, right? They generate lots of money and they pay it back to the university. And with this going, then the boards of trustees of colleges and universities started saying, hey, deans, you have to get your school up. I actually had a dean at NYU who, when he came in, was told, you must put NYU into the top 5 business schools. Well, you know, there were 5 schools already there, and none of them were prepared to commit suicide. So create a space. So he'd actually been given an impossible assignment. And NYU at that time ranked 13th. How are they going to go from 13 to 5th, right? It's not possible, right? Okay, now, journal quality enters this only kind of indirectly. Some of the magazines actually look at journals where the faculty publish as part of their ratings. The Financial Times does that rather explicitly. But a more relevant issue is that the deans of business schools, and I think probably deans of arts and sciences too, I have some data to suggest the same patterns are happening there, suddenly realize that they can't trust their faculty. If you ask the faculty at NES, how good is Anton? They're all going to say, oh, he's a nice guy, I like him. Should he be promoted? Yes, of course he should be promoted, right? All this. When I went to NYU, I went and joined a department that had such low reputation with the rest of the business school that they totally ignored what the department said. This department had promoted to tenure a woman who had 2 publications, one that she'd written by herself and one she'd written by somebody else, and they said that she should get tenure after 5 years. And when the school level committee saw this, they said this department has lost its mind. They have totally, there's no credibility anymore. So they just threw away anything the department sent to them and began doing their own searches. When the year came to evaluate personnel, this school committee would just evaluate people itself, and then they would look up their friends at other universities and ask for opinions about people and so forth, and they totally ignored everything the department did. Part of my job when I got there was to try to restore the credibility of this department because it just was in the tank. But more generally, deans do distrust faculty ratings, and they have good reason to distrust faculty ratings. And so the deans want something that looks objective. What are they going to use? They're going to use things like citation counts. They're going to use things like counts of numbers of articles in the top journals, right? They look something that the faculty can't manipulate. Well, of course, there's also this imitation process. The business school deans all meet once a year. And it's amazing how they all come back saying the same things. Because they go to the meeting and some of them hear speeches that they like, they impress them. Others they get around and they talk to each other and they pick up the same rumors. And in the late, or maybe early 90s, they all came back talking about A journals. I'd never heard anybody talk about A journals before that moment. But suddenly, about, well, not 20 years ago, 18 years ago or something like that, deans all over the country, all over the U.S., began talking about A journals. I think it came to Europe a little later because, well, around 2003, I think, I began hearing the French deans talking about A journals, right? So I got into this because my department head came to me and said, would I chair a committee, and we'd have a committee, and they would identify the A journals in management. And I got curious about this because I'd been on lots of editorial boards, and I didn't think there was that much difference between my reviews for A journals and my reviews for lower-ranking journals. Is that if there were differences in the journals, it wasn't because of mine reviewing. But I got curious about why is this happening? Why is there this talk suddenly about A journals? So I wrote to people that I knew at 16 of the top 20 business schools, and I said, does your department focus exclusively on A journals? And if it does, how long has it been doing that? And if it doesn't, what else do you do? 6 of the 16 wrote back and said, we have been doing A journals, we've been focusing on A journals for a very long time. And that's our primary criterion. And their average ranking of those 6 respondents was a 6.6, where 1 is the highest ranking business school according to the Business Week rankings, right? So my business schools have numbers ranging from 1 to 20. And although there are only 16 of them, I had from the top 20 schools. And these guys had a very high average ranking. As compared to the others that did not say this, they had a much lower average ranking. Then 6 people replied to me and said, no, our department has been making its own decisions on its own criteria for a long time, and we don't especially pay attention to A journals. We read the articles that people wrote, we decide whether we like them or we don't like them, and so forth. So it's our own independent judgment. And then 4 people wrote back and said, we've only recently started to emphasize A journals. And their average ranking was 16, right? In other words, they were at the bottom of the 20s, right? As compared to those on the other end, right? So I think it's pretty obvious what was going on here, is that the lower ranking schools near the top of the rankings were all imitating the higher ranking schools. And, you know, NYU wanted to be like Stanford, or whatever, right? This is a message that my department had sent to us. What you'll notice is there's nothing in this message about the content of the course. There's nothing about what are we teaching or anything, right? It's just what are we going to call it, because everybody else is calling it this, right? Lemming behavior. Now, this is studies of some management journals. One of these numbers I put up yesterday. But this emphasis on A journals is feeding everything, right? You all want to publish in A journals. The journals all want to be A journals. The deans all want A journals. So everybody's pushing for this stuff, right? But what that means is many, many more people, different people, are publishing in A journals now. But it's taking very much longer to do it. It's a much more difficult task to accomplish. This is the emphasis on citations, not on just A journals, but citations of articles. And these are 131 business journals. This would include all the major economics journals in this. And this is a logarithmic scale. So these are the logarithms here. But down here are their basic means. Back in 2000, the average article got only 3/4 of 1 citation in the first 2 years. The impact ratings are only the first 2 years. In 2009, the average article was getting 1.5 citations in the first 2 years out. In other words, the citations had approximately doubled in that period. A similar process has been happening in other fields other than those business-related ones. This would be sociology, psychology, philosophy, whatever, right? But they've gone up only about 50%. They started with a higher citation rate. Usually they have longer bibliographies at the ends of their articles, so their citation rates are intrinsically higher. but they've only gone up about 50%. Now, when I was back trying to study this process, one of my colleagues pointed out to me an article by a man named Ellison, who wrote an article in the Journal of Political Economy, and he talked about how it was that the top 5 economics journals had become more and more focus of attention. And this is what he had as his data. He identified what he thought were the top 5 economics journals, and that's the solid line at the top. And then he had 11 journals that he called second-tier journals, and then he had 5 journals he called third-tier journals. These are my actual citation counts, but with his classification of journals. And I looked at this, and I thought it was really kind of interesting. But then I got to musing about it, and I wondered if there was an optical illusion. What he had done was he had identified the most prestigious journals at the end of the time period he studied. So it's inevitable that the journals that are most prestigious at the end of the time period are going to have higher rankings than they did at the beginning of the time period, unless there is no change at all, right? There's no way it could go down. The curve can go down. So what I did was I went back and went over the 20 years and reclassified the journals every single year. But rather than just try to do the top 5, I took the top 20%, the second 20%, and so forth. And this is what I got. In fact, there is no sign that, at least if you look at the top 20% of economics journals, that there's been any increasing emphasis on the top journals. It's been more or less a horizontal pattern over the time. This is all economics journals, only economics journals. Now, the publishing industry. You know, it used to be that universities had libraries, and the libraries had books in them. I was in Birmingham last fall. They're building a new library in the center of Birmingham, 8 stories, and they expected to have no books in it. No books in the library. When I was at Cornell, we got interested in what does Cornell reward with its faculty. So we took a whole lot of faculty, we got their salary data, and then we got their publications and their teaching and the teaching ratings and all the stuff we could get, and we tried to analyze this stuff. And we concluded everybody got paid about the same for their teaching. It didn't seem to matter whether they taught big classes or little classes, or whether they taught well or they taught poorly or whatever. They all got about the same piece of money every year for teaching. And the differences were all due to research. But then we tried to figure out how do you assess the value of different kinds of publications. And we concluded that a research book was getting rewarded by Cornell about equal to 3 articles. So there was actually a trade-off. And in the late 80s, Colleen and I were publishing a pair of great big books with Oxford University Press. And I inquired with Oxford University Press about their technology and their economics. And they explained at that time that there were 900 libraries in the world that had a blanket order would buy anything that Oxford published. But with the existing technology, Oxford had to sell 1,200 copies of a book in order to break it even. They didn't make a profit until they sold more than 1,200 copies. Thus, they had a problem of inventory. They had to print more than 1,200 because they had to put some in inventory because it was rather expensive to print additional copies. Say they think they're going to sell 1,500, they better print 1,500 up front, right? And the forecasting problem was a serious problem. If you print 5,000 copies and you sell 1,500, you've lost a lot of money. Between 1980 and now, a lot of new journals have appeared. If I I could in fact show you this with the those graphs like I showed you for the Ellison stuff. The citations for any specific journal, you saw in Ellison the top journals appeared to have sort of dropped. Well, that's basically because of new entries into the journal publishing business. Each of these new little journals takes only a small fraction of the readership, but there are lots of them. And together they're like little tiny minnows biting away and eating up lots of stuff. And so actually the top journals are getting less and less citations compared to the others, but because there's so many others. And I don't know what your experience is, but I have found that I sometimes get as many as 5, 8, 10 new journals a week being coming to me on my email saying, we're launching these new journals. In fact, I even get things that say, would you like to referee for any of our journals at all? You know, just check off the list and we'll be happy to send you some things, whatever. Well, how did the libraries deal with this problem? Well, they stopped buying books. They started buying journals instead of books. There are a lot of advantages to that, especially when they got into electronics. Because the books have to be shelved, they have to be kept track of, people tear the pages out, whatever. But printing technology itself has changed a great deal. And the English language has become very important. I think probably, in my experience, the most important event for the English language was the European Union's adoption of English. Because all of a sudden, professors all over Europe discovered that they were being asked to publish in English language. This means, well, it means a bunch of things. One is it means Americans became more important than they had been. It also means that those English language journals became much more important than they ever had been, right? It's very much a kind of a waste of time to publish in French, for example. I do sometimes, but you get no citations when you publish in French, so what are you going to gain from that? So I went back a year and a half ago to Oxford and once again asked what's going on. At that point, there are only 250 libraries left that would buy everything that Oxford publishes, not the 900 that used to be there. But the minimum number of books you could print and still break even was 300, not 1,200, right? Because of the improved printing technology. And the most dramatic thing is that once you've printed a book, you can produce additional copies of it at no cost disadvantage. There are companies out there that will, you can say, I want 5 more copies of this book. And they'll produce those 5 copies at a price that is very similar to what it would have cost you to print it initially, right? So they no longer have to put anything in inventory. They just print their 300 copies. They take only a risk of 50 copies. And they can wait until they get an accumulated of, say, 10 orders or 20 orders or whatever, and then they print the 10 books or the 20 books. But the libraries have gone almost out of the book business, and they're out of the paper journal business. They're getting them all on the internet or on CD-ROMs. So this improved technology, the book publishers are even in worse mess today than they were when they had the different economic system, right? It's getting worse and worse for them. SSRN has become a very prominent thing. Do you folks get notices from SSRN? My wife and I published an article about a year ago in a French book. Nobody ever saw it. So I listed it on SSRN. And Joan was amused to get an email from them saying she was now the 119,643rd ranked author in the SSRN list, right? Well, anyway. You can see that we're soon going to have no more paper journals. We're going to have very few books. I've been thinking about writing a book, actually, and I'm wondering, why am I doing this? What is going to be the point? your articles get posted online almost as soon as they're accepted, right? So there's really not a delay for publication that there used to be. Of course, I don't know what that does to this impact ratings. So what do we know about the editorial process? I talked about this a little yesterday. Editors' decisions are about acceptance and rejection are more likely to be wrong than right. We know that for sure. And this is the data I gave you yesterday from 16 journals that have published the correlations between two reviewers, and these are abysmally low correlations. What it implies is that this is the world in which you live, in which the quality of your writing is on one axis and the evaluations of the reviewers is on the other axis, and you have almost any outcome is possible from almost any manuscript. The central problem isn't a technical problem. It is we simply don't agree with each other about what we're trying to do, right? We don't agree about whether this piece of work is a good piece of work or a bad piece of work or whatever. We could sit here and argue. If we take one specific paper, the group of us could sit here and argue about it the rest of the day. What we do know from a man named Gottfredson did his doctoral dissertation about the publication process in psychology. And what he found was that if he gave a whole lot of people lists of adjectives and said which ones are important or not important or whatever in evaluating manuscripts, people pretty much agreed about what the properties should be. There's a fairly high coefficient of concordance. Then he gave them specific manuscripts and said, rate these manuscripts on the properties. And the correlations between the people were very low. People can agree what they want in abstract terms. They can't agree about whether specific instances fit those characteristics. And this is one of the more appalling numbers. Some journals actually get something that looked like numerical measures of, these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if you can get those numerical measures, you can find out what did referees say about the expected future impact of an article. Then you can correlate that average rating with the actual citations to that article over, say, 5 years. The average citation, average correlation across all manuscripts is 0.14. That's an appallingly low correlation. But it's worse than you might say, because this is like the manuscript quality is like a log normal distribution with a long tail, and if you take the top 10% or so off that, you'll actually get a correlation that's essentially zero between what referees say and the actual citations to the manuscripts later. It's also the case, and I'm not going to go through all the different biases, but reviewers are human beings with every bias that you can imagine happening. And there are research studies that will go through and document all these different things. One of the studies that I found in some ways most, I would say upsetting, I guess. They took a manuscript written by Norwegians in one of the Norwegian languages. Norway has multiple languages, but this would be the main language of the South. They translated that article into English, and then they gave it to Norwegian reviewers. And the Norwegian reviewers gave higher ratings to the same article written in English than they gave it when written in the Norwegian language. It's the aura, right? Another study, and this one has upset everybody in the world. Peters and Ceci chose 12 articles that have been published in 12 of the most prestigious psychology journals. Every article they chose was chosen because it had been written by a famous psychologist who was working in a highly prestigious psychology department. That was the criterion. They then retyped all the articles and gave them authors with invented names and placed them at ignominious universities. And resubmitted the articles to the journals that had published them 18 to 24 months before. So now we have 12 editors and 24 reviewers looking at these 12 articles.
Different set.
What?
Different set of editors and reviewers. Not
Well,
the same.
it depends. It's the same journal, but whether the editor changed or not, it would be different reviewers in general. How would you know they're the same reviewers? But some of the editors would have changed, and some of the editors would have been the same.
And they didn't recognize the
Yeah,
papers?
I remember. It seemed the case was recognized.
One editor and 2 reviewers noticed that these articles had been previously published. Okay. But that blew out 3 of their 12 manuscripts. So now they're left with only 9 manuscripts that are being evaluated by 18 reviewers. 16 of the 18 reviewers said reject.
They didn't even Google it.
And 8 of the 9 review
Google was
editors,
available in 1980.
I say it is, sorry.
8 of the 9 reviewers, editors rejected. Right? One editor asked for revisions. When this was published, it was published with 55 pages of angry commentary, mostly by editors who said this is outrageous, unethical behavior.
On whose part?
On the part of the authors, of course, Peters and Ceci, who deceived the editors by giving them.
How was not this paper rejected
So,
by the editor?
Sorry, what?
This paper had been rejected by the editor.
So, somebody asked me yesterday, or said, is it better to have an article written by a famous person, right? Do they have a better chance of being published? What do you think?
If you put their name there.
Yeah, if their name is
there
on the paper, right. Yeah.
Well, I don't know, how can you persuade like very famous people that you can run an experiment the other way around? Take like really crappy papers. And put them
Take
in
really crappy papers.
Yeah, rejected papers.
Well, what if they got published and won a Nobel Prize? That'd be really bad. All right, this is another study. Mr. Mahoney did another naughty thing. In his field, there had been a controversy, and a bunch of people were known to have published articles that were either in favor or opposed to a specific viewpoint, right? So let's call this A. And so he had people who said, yes, A, and people who said, not A. He got an empirical paper, or what appeared to be such, with very clear-cut results, and he constructed one version of it that the data supported A, and one version of it that the data supported not A. All he had to do was invert a bunch of scales, right? And then he had his 2x2 table. Those reviewers who had said A in print or not A in print, and articles that said A or not A, and you can conjecture exactly what the outcome was, right? But what's interesting about this was that people did not say, I don't want to see this article published because it contradicts what I wrote, right? No, they always blame it on methodology. You have the wrong data, you use the wrong method of analysis, your discussion is unclear. Methodology is our excuse for our personal biases. That's a really important point, right? We hide our personal biases by talking about methodology.
This kind of quantitative, whatever quantitative analysis, what Thomas Kuhn was saying about change of paradigms in science in general, was saying that people reject everything that is disaccords with their belief until the amount of evidence contrary.
Right, until it's impossible. Yes. Yeah. Now, we know that the correlation between two reviewers is approximately 0.18. But whenever the correlation between reviewers is less than 0.35, the journals are going to reject more of the best articles than they're going to accept. Right? It's not because they're trying to do it badly, they simply have errors of perception, and they don't recognize what they have. So we don't know exactly what percentage of the best articles they reject, but we know it's got to be somewhat over 50% are being rejected. And you can write the best articles that are written, and something over 50% of your articles are going to be rejected. Getting a rejection letter is not a sign that your research is bad. It may be bad. I can't guarantee you that it isn't, but it might be that that it's just the reviewers. So, of course, this is what looks normal to us, right? Rejection, rejection, rejection. And it happens to us all the time. So you have to figure out how to deal with this. This is your self-management problem. These people write their comments, and it always seems as if they're criticizing you. Sometimes they're arrogant, they're stupid, they say things that are wrong, whatever. Now, sometimes that's actually true, but I think it's rare. Most of the time, I think that what happens is that we read these comments defensively. We don't read them as just statements by somebody who read this and had a reaction. We read them as actual comments on what we did, which they're probably not. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about from now on is really about this problem that we have as reactors. Now, everybody's biased negatively. The average reviewer says reject 60% of the time. It's nothing like an equal distribution between accept, revise, and reject. So reject is a very high likelihood. And that's true of editors as well. But with this disagreement among reviewers, reviewers only make decisions about 55% of the time. 45% of the time, it's the editor is left to make the decision, even after 2 revisions. Right? But the editor is also likely to say reject 60% of the time, right? So it's just that this is a process without a lot of, reliability in what's going on. Our typical editor, right, working through problems. This is how it always, this is how it feels to me, right? I get these referee reports back, and sometimes I think they're insulting me. Sometimes I think they're just really stupid. They don't know the right methodologies. Patrick talked yesterday about one time you were reviewing a manuscript, and you said all their methodologies are wrong, but the more you dug into it, the more you decided they were right.
I was biased against them. I know that.
Right. And we know all these things, right? That you get 2 reviews back, and one says go left and the other says go right, and what are you going to do? And it's all their fault. But our problem is that we have to deal with people like this. In our world, it isn't just those 2 reviewers. They're a representative sample out of the world in which we live. So our world is filled with people like this.
And actually, we are the people.
We're unfortunate. So there's nothing else to do. You simply have to suck it up. You have to deal with this, right? This is your reality. You can't change it. We can't go back and say, well, we wish it was a different world. It isn't a different world. This is the thing we have to deal with. Now, sometimes people ask me to talk about where to publish. Maybe you all know, but I think before you write a manuscript, and especially now that we have word processors, this is an easy thing to do. Pick the journal you're writing it for and write the manuscript for that specific journal. Don't write a manuscript and then think about what journal am I going to send it to. Think about what does that journal typically look like? How long are the reference lists? Do they always have statistical tables? Do they never have statistical tables? Whatever. But you have to have a journal that fits the kind of thing you want to write. And you kind of start there. One thing is really helpful, I think, is to look to see, can you legitimately cite several articles from that journal? Are they really relevant? Because that means you're writing on a theme that the journal has shown some interest in the past. And the other thing is, I'm going to advocate generally sending to highly prestigious journals first. And I have a listing on my website. I told you yesterday I mentioned this website. This is my personal website at NYU. And down at the bottom of that page, I have filtered impact ratings. These are the impact ratings that the Institute for Scientific Information puts out. But I process those with exponential smoothing so that it takes out some of the short-term trends and gives up more of a longer-term trajectory. And I think those are more reliable data. And you can look at the lists and see what are the things near the top that look like the kind of the journals at which it makes sense to submit. I've already said yesterday that I advocate going to these prestigious journals because I think the reviewers try harder for them. They're trying to impress the editors with what wise and sensible people they are. They usually write longer reviews, and they're trying to, be careful. If you send to a less prestigious journal, it may be that the reviewer will be careful, but I think there's less incentive for them to be careful. So, now I'm not saying send to the prestigious journal on the assumption you'll get accepted. No, it's probably going to get rejected, but you're going to get good information back from that first round of reviews. And that's what you need to get. Your colleagues are going to be a really bad source of information about your manuscripts. You need information from third parties that you don't even know. And so this is the best way to get it.
Actually, what do you think? I've seen some people follow the strategy of submitting work to top-tier journals that doesn't really even plausibly...
Well, that may be a waste of time, but usually they'll get a desk reject if it's that bad.
It's not a big waste of time.
I guess what I'm asking is, do you think that there's... let me say it this way. I've seen people that have written articles that are really geared toward B journals, and the only reason they sent it to an A was so they could get good feedback. And
I would do it.
I've heard griping from the editorial side that this is sort of abuse of the system.
Why? They have the right to reject them, a desk reject if they want.
Okay.
But if they send them out for review, right?
Is there any reservation that hurts your reputation with editors? Like, an editor will remember that you are sending crappy papers.
Well, I I don't write crappy papers, I'm sorry.
How did
I
it
have
to be journalist?
I have no experience with crappy papers, okay? All of my papers are wonderful. No. I mean, if you picked a journal that you really think is a likely journal to publish, I wouldn't send everything I wrote to the American Economic Review. It's not an appropriate journal for everything, right? That's the issue. But I'm just saying, insofar as you are within the correct domain of topics, go for a journal that is more precise. Don't put yourself down, is another way to say it. Don't put yourself into a D journal because you think you're not good enough. Let them decide that. Let them tell you you're not good. Their error rate is pretty high, you know. Even if you're no good, they may accept it. But that's not a joke. Really, their error rate is very high, right? Don't make the mistake of sending the same manuscript to two different journals at the same time. Some people, especially when they're junior faculty, newly out, they think, well, I'm probably going to get rejected, so I'll send it to two places, and the odds are that both of them were rejected, but maybe one will accept it, and I'll speed everything up. But that can be very costly if the two journals send your manuscript to the same reviewers, and the editors find out. Then you do have editors who are mad. Editors have to work hard to get reviewers. Most people get tired of reviewing. There's so many manuscripts to review. And editors kind of have to work hard to get people to review, and they don't want to waste that effort on things that are... I also think it makes sense to try to write different kinds of audiences. That's what I mean by diversification. Write for managers as well as for economists. Write for finance as well as economics. Write for marketing, whatever. But when you do one study, there's usually a way to cut it in more than one direction so that it has different audiences, right? And that's perfectly legitimate. You can send off two manuscripts off the same study at the same time, as long as they're really rather different manuscripts with different objectives. Now, you would say this is obvious, but it's not really obvious, because I've received, if you're an editor of a journal, and you receive a manuscript with a cover letter that has the wrong name for you, maybe your predecessor, or maybe your name is misspelled or something, and or the wrong name for the journal, you immediately know a couple of things. One, probably this author isn't somebody you have to pay a lot of attention to because they're not that tuned into this field, and or they're sloppy scholars. If they make mistakes like this in their cover letter, what are their data looking like? Right? Now, I'm a very strong believer in Word Style and Grammar Checker. And Word will default to only checking grammar. You have to go tell Word under Word options to check style as well. And I personally run that style and grammar checker on all my manuscripts and try to deal with everything it points out. That doesn't mean you always do everything it says. It means that every time it has a problem, you ought to make some changes that deal with it. And you can use Word to verify the references. You can use this grammar checker to verify the references. With the references at the end, as you go through the manuscript and you check off, you say, recognize this name. When you get to the reference list, it ought to go through the reference list and not find any new names. But if you take all the reference list and put it at the top of the article and start it with the reference list, then it ought not find anything in the text, citations in the text, that it didn't find in the reference list, right? So it's a quick way to cross-check your references against the text. Now, there's a man who's about to become the president of the Academy of Management. His name is Ming-Jer Chen. Ming-Jer was born in Taiwan, and he went to college in Maryland. He went to the University of Maryland for his PhD. I first met him when he was graduating with his PhD, and he was a job candidate. He got a job at Columbia University. He twice authored articles and won awards for the best article in a prestigious journal. And he was co-authoring with a friend of mine, and they'd finished writing their manuscript. And Ming-Jer, when you talk with him, when I first met him, I thought he was an American. It never occurred to me he was born outside the United States. That's how his English was. They finished writing their manuscript, and Ming-Jer said to my friend, "Now I'm going to send it to a copy editor." My friend said, "But Ming-Jer, why would you send this to a copy editor? Your English is as good as mine." And Ming-Jer said, "Yes, but this is my career." Right? That's, I think, a legitimate point to make for anybody whose native language isn't English. The cost of getting a copy editor is very low compared to the potential risks in this. Right?
I would argue that if your native language is English, you still need it.
Well, probably that too, yes. It depends on the copy editor, but yes. Yeah. And then this is the obvious thing too, and this is becoming a less necessary piece of advice. It used to be that almost all journals were run by a part-time secretary with some cards in a file box. And manuscripts got lost routinely, and all kinds of things would happen. So you'd send your manuscript off, and months would pass, you'd hear nothing, and then it would turn out they hadn't even opened the envelope or something of that sort, right? So it's useful to follow up, unless if your paper is in like the manuscript central system, then you're probably safe, because I think the computer system will keep track of what's happening. But be careful in this following up, that if you are in fact dealing with a little old lady in a closet someplace, that you don't upset her, right? So I always say use a telephone or something so that you could, I mean, maybe not from here, but you have to be very delicate, I'm saying. And don't make an assumption that they're being sloppy and they're not paying attention to you. They may be trying really hard to get the thing reviewed. I believe you should always revise every time you get a referee report. And you should revise in response to every single comment that the referee made. Even if you think it's an outrageously stupid comment, you should deal with it. But you shouldn't do it immediately. You should wait. Wait at least 2 weeks, maybe longer. Because you have to wait long enough that you cannot get upset when you read what they said, right? You have to be able to read what they said with utter calm, as if you're reading the evening paper, right? It has to be data that you're looking at. You're not reading what they said to get the facts. You know that their facts are biased. You're not reading what they said to find out what to do, because you know they probably don't know what to do. You're reading to see what did they think when they read what you wrote. This is like Pavlov and the dogs. You have shown food to the dogs. The referees are the dogs, and they salivate, right? You want to know, why did they salivate? What about what you presented made them salivate? They're just telling you what they think. They're not telling you what is true. They're not telling you what is right. They're just telling you what they think, right? And they're human beings just filled with all kinds of messes. But their value is that they're a representative sample of a lot of human beings. problem with colleagues is they don't want to hurt your feelings. And you give them your manuscript, and they probably don't even read it. You give them your manuscript, and maybe they'll read the abstract or something, and a couple of days later you go back and say, what did you think about the manuscript? And he said, oh, it was really good, interesting. I think, well, I'm glad I had the opportunity to read, right? And what have you found out from that? Probably the main thing you found out is their office is 2 doors from yours, right? And they're polite. Now, I got a referee report this is way back in the 1960s, before you folks were born. And I was as outraged as always, right? I was probably running up and down the halls, raving about the stupid reviewers. And I stopped myself, and I formulated this rule that's in bold red print. And I followed it ever since. I call it my golden rule. And it says, no reviewer is ever wrong. Now, obviously, we know reviewers make all kinds of mistakes. But they don't make mistakes about what they thought when they wrote. They're only telling you what they thought at the time they wrote. They're only telling you about their reactions. This is data about consumers. You're selling toothpaste, and they put the toothpaste in their mouth and they spit it out. They don't like it. That's all they're doing. Now, whether your toothpaste is good toothpaste or bad, that's not the issue. The issue is this reviewer didn't like your toothpaste. What are you going to do about it? You can say, well, I'm not going to try to sell toothpaste to people like that, right? Or you can say, I'll change the flavor.
How much time should you struggle with sort of an odd comment? Like, you know, if you can't make sense of, you know, the thought process.
Send back the dust.
There's always a thought process, though.
But I mean, how much time should you invest in trying to forensically?
You got to bear in mind, no reviewer ever intentionally writes down something stupid. They don't say, oh, I think I'll write a stupid sentence, right? They had some reason for saying that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so you got to figure out, why the hell did they do this? What were they thinking? What did I say that made them think that way?
But I mean, if it doesn't come to you, like,
Well,
then
I don't know.
just, I mean, should you invest? I'm asking just how much time do you think you should invest, or if you should take it as face value, like your reaction to
Wait,
what they.
are you talking about? Actually, it's important to be clear here. Are you talking about a situation where you have comments that are revise and resubmit, or
No,
is it a situation where?
He's talking about it in the reviewer's comments. There's a sentence that makes no sense.
Right, but doesn't it make a difference whether it's revise and resubmit or whether it's a reject and he's
No,
just trying to incorporate?
I would say in any event, you're trying to figure out, why did that reviewer say that? And what did I say that led them to say that? Now, you may say, well, I don't care, but yeah, it's always this diagnostic, detective problem, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure you can always solve all those problems. Sometimes you can ask. You can write back and say, why did you say this?
To the editor?
See, the main thing here is that you have to separate yourself from your emotional reactions to this whole thing, right? You have to get really calm, cool, detached. Your brain searching down, you're cutting in. Forget that it's a human being you're cutting open, right? So you got to get into that calm, cool state. And yeah, be reflective and just try as best you can. These are just consumer data. Maybe some consumers aren't understandable, but usually they are. I go through every single comment and do something with it, right? Something. And I explain what I did, too.
And if they contradict each other, so what shall we do? If one reviewer asks to apply one method, another reviewer asks to apply the opposite method, so what shall I do?
Well, just hang in with me for a minute. I think I'll kind of answer that question, right? The first response here is you've got to actually try to deal with this straight up. And sometimes they're absolutely right. Right? For example, when I first did my paper about the citation rates and why, how different are prestigious journals from less prestigious journals, and I sent it off to a journal, one reviewer wrote back and said, "Did you know that 2 other people had already published this article?" No, I wouldn't have written it if I knew. It turned out, of course, they made very different assumptions than I had made, but it was on the same basic idea of how reliable are the reviewers, right? And they just made some ad hoc assumptions, whereas I had gotten data, but I hadn't been aware that they'd done it. Their article had been in sociology, and I hadn't read that domain, right? So it was very important, A, that I cite their article, but also that I think about what they said, right? So, yeah, sometimes I'm just stupid, I don't know things, and you learn this. Another thing that happened in the same article, I was using 3 different kinds of correlation coefficients, and it was more or less substitutes for each other. And one of the reviewers pointed out that these are 3 very different kinds of correlation coefficients, and they don't map nicely onto each other. So then I had to spend 3 months reworking all my data to deal with the 3 different kinds of correlation coefficients. And then the editor told me I had to cut all that out of the paper. But hey, that's our business, right? This is the central issue, right? Is that no one ever thinks that sets out to say stupid things. So whenever they say something, they think they're trying to be helpful. They think they're trying to say something intelligent. They're probably not trying to be insulting. Some of them may be trying to be amusing, which I think is probably a bad move, right? This is not the context in which one makes jokes. But if, in fact, it's an important kind of an issue that they're raising, and you don't understand exactly what they're saying, you can write back to them. You can write back and say, "I'm not sure I understand what you're about here, and could you give me some more input?" But don't do everything they tell you to do. This is your paper, not their paper. Eric Abrahamson was a doctoral student in my course. And he got the idea that he could compare the annual reports of companies going bankrupt with the annual reports of companies that were not going bankrupt and find the differences in what they said, in the letters to the stockholders. And he'd been studying sociology as a minor subject. And so he formulated a whole bunch of hypotheses based on his sociology. He gathered data from airlines that went bankrupt and got a matched sample of airlines that 5 years before bankruptcy had looked exactly the same in age and size and so forth, and then analyzed their annual reports. And he did his statistics and found no significant difference between the 2 samples. So he went back and recoded all the data, got new hypotheses, did it all again, and again did the statistics, and got no difference between the samples. So he presented a seminar to the faculty and doctoral students. And the faculty and doctoral students said, "Well, you didn't think of this, you didn't think of that, you should try this hypothesis, and a better way to code the data would be like this." So he went back and he did all those things and really analyzed the data and got no differences. So he reformulated the whole study as a study in how it is useful for companies not to report explicitly that they're about to go bankrupt, right? And he sent it off to a very prestigious journal, and he got back a 6-page report from the editor that we thought was revised. Oh my God, here's a doctoral student with a revised letter. So he worked on it, did all these things. He sent it back in, and they said, why are you sending this to us? We rejected your article. He said, well, I didn't know you'd rejected my article. I thought you made all these suggestions. They said, okay, we'll review it again. They sent it to 2 reviewers. The reviewers said, well, you didn't think of this hypothesis, you didn't think of that hypothesis, you really should measure these variables a different way. So he did all this, he sent it back, and they said, well, we want a revision. We realized you also didn't think of this, and you also didn't think of that, and it would be better if you measured it this way. So he did that, sent it back in. Now we're sure he's going to get an acceptance. They rejected it. Outright. Bad methodology. So he sent it to another journal. And the same exact pattern happened. 3 revisions and a final rejection for bad methodology. So he sent it to a 3rd journal. They sent it to me, and I rejected it. I had been his advisor on the first pass, but when I got it, it was like 45 pages. It had every statistical test you could imagine, 6 different ways to measure all the variables, right? It was unintelligible. You couldn't figure out what it was about. He'd lost the story in trying to please all these referees. Right? It's a very simple story, which is companies have all kinds of reasons not to tell you that they're going bankrupt, right? I think in general you should send manuscripts back to the journal that rejected them. After all, it's your life, not theirs. You should be deciding who's going to publish your stuff. Right? If in fact they rejected your article for very good reasons, then when you revise it, it's going to be a very different article. So then, resending it back to the same journal is an appropriate response, isn't it?
It better be very substantial. You don't think you'd be really abusing your whatever iota of credibility?
I can only tell you I've published several articles in prestigious journals that were rejected by those journals. Right. Let me tell you about one. When little desktop computers were brand new, this is like 1980, I sat down and in 1 month I wrote 3 manuscripts. I just got carried away. I'd never seen a word processor before. One of these, I produced a 40-page manuscript, which is really, really stupid. You should never have a manuscript that long. But I sent it to the American Sociological Review, the most prestigious journal in sociology. I'm very hopeful. 3 months later, I get back an editor's letter rejecting my manuscript and 2 referee reports. One referee just loved my manuscript, and the other referee just hated my manuscript. Absolutely everything. There was nothing. Well, I'm very upset. So I wait my 6 weeks. I follow my own advice, right? And then I sit down and very carefully go through everything every one of these referees said. I end up with a manuscript that's 64 pages because, of course, I had to deal with everything they said. And I sent it back to the editor, and I said, now, this is in fact a revision of the article I sent to you earlier, but it's very, very different. I think if you just look at it, you'll see it's very, very different. The reason it's very different is that I tried to deal with everything these referees said, and they produced massive changes. So you can either regard it as a new submission or as a revision. Time passed. 6 weeks. Again, I get back 2 referee reports. One just loved it, and the other one just hated it, right? And you can probably do the math, right? The editor's letter said, call me. So I called him up. He said, I'll publish half of it. I said, what do you mean? He said, I'll publish 32 pages. It's 64 pages, I will publish 32 pages. I said, which 32 pages? He says, that's not my decision. You decide what I will put you publish.
Even ones.
What?
All
Even
the-
number. It's going to get worse. It's going to get worse. So I went to work, and I chopped out this. I took out one whole section. I took out some examples. I'm down to 40 pages. I call him up and I say, I've got it down to 40 pages. Is that good enough? He said, no. I said, I published 32 pages. You have 40 pages, I won't publish it. I said, what can I do? He says, you have too many references. You have 8 pages of references. 3 pages of references are more than enough. Well, I took out 5 pages of references, and I took out all the citations in the text for those references. So, now we're down in the low 30s, right? I say, I've got 35 pages. I call him up. 35 pages. He said, well, then I won't publish it. I said, owed you 32 pages. I said, what can I do? He says, take out the word the. The word the almost never does anything, he says. If you will go to the American Sociological Review, you will not find the word the in the manuscript. And you will find that it was 32 pages.
I guess I have also resubmitted a rejected paper to the same journal, but it was the editor had had explicitly left the door open with saying, he literally said in his rejection letter, I could see publishing this paper if you could address the problems, but I see no way in hell you can address the problems.
Mm-hmm.
And so after we addressed them, we submitted, but we also asked permission. And he said, I flipped through the paper, it looks substantially different,
Right.
I'll treat it as
But
new.
yeah, no, you really have to make a different paper, but if they have legitimate issues, you have to address them anyway, right? If you pick the right journal in the first place, it's probably still the right journal. But when you send your manuscripts back, send back a detailed, point-by-point commentary. This is what the referee said, this is what I did about it. This is what the referee said, this is what I did about it. You don't have to be defensive about that. If the referee said, I don't know, paint everything red, all you have to do is say, done. I did it, right? It's all red. Yeah. But you don't have to explain. I don't like red, but I did it anyway. You don't have to go into all that, right? But if you actually don't agree with them, if you have two referees that ask you to do different things, that simply opens up an opportunity for you. You can choose which way you want to go. You say, thank you very much, but, you know, this one said to do that, this one said... Oh. Well, and the thing is, if you just keep on revising and revising, at some point the editor is going to side with you and against the reviewers. As an editor, I've had reviewers who would ask for one set of changes on the first pass, and then when they get a revision, they ask for yet another set of things that they'd never raised on the first pass, and I sort of felt like this is improper behavior. That you had your chance. You told them what you thought. Quit. Now, this is one last reference for you. These are a whole series of chapters, like 20 chapters, by different journal editors about what they were trying to do. So it's sort of, what's an editor's perspective on what they're trying to do? Of course, some of them think they want to be your co-author. Other ones think that they're guarding the palace. The whole different spectrum of things you could imagine actually does happen. I think this is near my end. We're done. So tomorrow I'm supposed to talk about how to write. Right. Nitty-gritty details of writing.
Is it gonna be at 11 as well?
I think so. Yeah, same deal, same room, same computer.
Well, thank you very much.